My name is Lauren Monaghan-Pisano, and I'm Director of Strategy and Partnerships here at English National Opera. I am a white woman in my early 40s, not my mid-30s, which is what I said earlier, and I have short brown hair, and my pronouns are she, her. So it is a huge pleasure to welcome you here today, whether you're in the room at the London Coliseum or whether you're joining us via our live stream on the University of Surrey's YouTube channel. And we're very delighted that you've joined us here for this conversation on inclusivity and opera. So I'd like to say a huge thank you to our co-hosts, the Theatrical Voice Research Centre at the University of Surrey and Dr. Barbara Gentili, as well as John Warburton. They have worked with us to co-create this event and provided the technology for our live stream today, and they have been a real joy to work with, so thank you so much. I'd also like to thank Black Lives in Music and Carol Leeming, who will be chairing our panel discussion later this afternoon, as well as our speakers from opera companies across England, Wales and Italy. So today marks the first of a public conversation that E&O is hosting about the topic of inclusivity in opera, and we hope that it will be the first of many. It's important to say that this is not a new conversation. There are colleagues in the sector who have been talking about this for a very long time, and those conversations have taken many different forms. But until we see genuine structural change in our sector in terms of who is represented in our companies from the very top to the bottom, and we see genuine representation in who is making and experiencing our work, it is a conversation that we will need to keep on having. And it is very critical to the future of our art form. So this event today is part of E&O's broader strategy to make opera more inclusive as an industry and more representative of the society in which we live today. So we hope that by coming together... Am I still on? Great, thank you. We hope that by coming together with other opera companies and sharing the brilliant work that they are doing in this space, we will be able to collectively learn from that excellent practice and move forward and make progress in this space. So this event is split into two parts. The first is we're going to have a talk from Barbara Gentili and Alexandra Wilson, and that part of the afternoon is a historical look at the notion of inclusivity in opera in the 20th century. And then we're going to move on to, we'll have a short break, and then we'll move on to the second part, which is looking at the ideas of inclusivity in opera through a contemporary lens. There'll be a chance to ask questions of as the audience, both after each of the talks and at the end of the panel discussion. And we hope that you'll all join us for drinks at the end of the day to have more chats. So, boring housekeeping, boring but important. So as you're aware, this event is being live streamed and it's also being photographed. If you don't want to be featured on the live stream or in our photographs, please could you make yourselves known to a member of staff and we'll give you a sticker so that we don't include you in any of the visuals. If we have a fire alarm, our wonderful access supervisor, Kizzy, can support you if you need to leave the building step-free. And then if you can walk, we will use the stairs, but the E&O staff will tell you what to do. There are toilets to my right. We're not going to use these during the event, so if you need to use the toilet, you can go down via the lift or the stairs to use the toilet down on one level. I think that's everything. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Barbara Gentili. She is an opera singer and music historian based at the University of Surrey and our co-host for this afternoon.
Very much, Lauren, for this wonderful introduction. I'm so pleased to be here with so many of you in the audience, and you might have noticed that under your seat there are post-it notes and a pen, and that is for you to use if you want in answer to this question: how has today's event changed your opinion about the ways in which opera has engaged with communities? You can do it as during the talks, or at the interval, or at the end of the event, and just leave the notes where you found it. We will collect it and use it for further studies. Now, I would like to use some notes and to take you on a journey into Italy's recent operatic history. The people I interviewed over the past 10 months are still active contributors to this history, but questions I ask them look into their past, thus the time frame for my talk. My pursuit is to understand the place, the relevance, or the irrelevance of opera in Italian society during these decades. So stay with me as we cross paths with people who experienced opera in many different ways, bringing a part of themselves into the experience. Before we start, I would like to treat you to some singing. This is it.
Salut, demeure chaste pure. Salut, demeure chaste pure. Où se devine la présence d'une âme innocente et divine. Salut, salut, demeure chaste pure. Qui se devine la présence d'une âme innocente.
Yeah, isn't it? So this was, let me just take, this was Angelo Zanotti, who lives, he was 86 at the time of this video, made last year. He lives in Casa Verdi, the home for retired musicians created by Giuseppe Verdi in Milan at the end of the 19th century. Verdi, whose many philanthropic initiatives were well hidden, left all the copyrights from his operas and other sources of income to Casa Verdi. The money has been invested throughout the decades, and with the addition of private donations, forms the capital of Fondazione Verdi, which is a private company. Verdi considered this home as l'opera mia più bella, my most beautiful opera. Angelo Zanotti, here he is in this picture, was born into a working class family in the Val Trompia, a valley in the province of Brescia, in the north of Italy. He tells me his family was financially okay because all the children worked. He started working aged 14 at the end of compulsory school, but he was a talented footballer and ended up in the under-16 national football team, although a bad injury terminated his career as a professional player. When I asked him how opera entered his life, he launches off on a dazzling narrative about his mom and her love for singing. Angelo's mom was a housewife and a fervent fan of Beniamino Gigli, one of the greatest opera celebrities on earth at that time. In the home, she would sing opera excerpts from Gigli's repertoire, so she sang tenor arias and tenor part in duets, and not music suited to her voice type. Angelo's mom's fanaticism for Gigli prompted her to rather epic enterprises. When the tenor performed at the Arena di Verona, an open-air space for summer opera season still functioning today, she would cycle in company of two girlfriends all the 80 kilometers, circa 50 miles, from Villa Calcina, the village where they lived, to Verona. After the performance, the three ladies would sleep in the fields and cycle back home the following morning. We are in the 1940s, a time when women in Italy were supposed to stay at home and look after the family. So the unescorted peregrinations of these three women rose more than one eyebrow in the village. Anyway, Angelo continues, my father, in order to discourage my mom's operatic adventures, decided to buy a gramophone. At this point, the gramophone and the discs of Beniamino Gigli entered the Zanotti family home. Angelo tells me, my mom would play these recordings all the time and sing along. I learned from her, and she was right to practice every day. It is the only way to maintain a flexible and healthy voice. This is an astonishing assertion about a busy housewife. Here, in a sudden and rather abrupt turn of the conversation, it is Angelo as a singer who speaks to me. From his point of view, his mom, a housewife, practiced every day, like she had to perform a role or train for a diploma. Why does he see this that way? Because singing has become the way he makes sense of life. Singing had always been with him since his teens. This man, whose childhood dream was to become a professional footballer, found himself immersed in the sound world of opera all the time, at home with his mom, in the football team bus, where during the journeys from one football pitch to the next, his pals would urge him to sing opera arias. At the local osteria, the Italian version of the pub, where his dad would put him on a table, age 7, to entertain his comrade with La Donna Immobile from Rigoletto. The sheer misery of post-war Italy forced Angelo to emigrate to Switzerland, where he worked in a factory as an expert milling machine operator. You can see him here. But in one of life's unpredictable turns, he ended up at the Geneva Conservatoire, where he studied under the accomplished Italian singer Anna Maria Guglielmetti. They are practicing in this other picture. Once ready, when his voice was fully trained, he returned to Italy, and in 1967 he qualified for the final round of Aslico, an international competition for young singers still running today. This final round took place at La Scala, where Mario Del Monaco and Giacinto Prandelli, two of the greatest tenors of the second half of the 20th century, happened to sit on the jurors' panel. The two singers liked him. From this point onwards, Angelo's narrative is filled with episodes about the long-lasting friendships he entertained with these two giants of opera singing. They continued to prepare Angelo with free singing tuitions, provided professional opportunities, and even lent money to him. Angelo played Cassio here to the many, in many occasions to the Otello of Mario del Monaco. When he greets me, visibly moved and tired, and is not alone, he asks me, in case I use interview material from my papers, to please remember the good that Mario and Del Monaco and Giacinto Prandelli did to him. So I'm reporting on that good today. There would be so much to say about the guests of Casa Verdi and the quality of information they are able to pass on about the relationship between Italians and opera from the post-war years to our day. But I picked Angelo's story because it contributes a different narrative. It gives a voice to the people who have been traditionally excluded from the official history of opera, a history that has been too often exclusively associated with the political, cultural, and financial power of the social elites. But let's continue our journey by traveling south from Milan to Parma, a delightful city of the Emilia-Romagna region, universally known for its prosciutto and its Parmesan cheese. The relationship between the people of Parma and their opera house, the Teatro Regio, is multifaceted. These interactions run deep in the fabric of society, as the inhabitants of Parma have participated in the life of the theatre in a variety of forms. As audiences, especially those sections sitting in the Loggione, the upper gallery, which feel the experience of a night at the opera with their overwhelming passion for the art form, they participated as single individuals who volunteered to fill a number of stage professions, thus allowing the opera house to function, and as non-professional members of the opera house's chorus. I will start from this latter element. For many decades, up until the year 2000, the chorus of the Teatro Regio was formed by a mix of professional and semi-professional singers. The latter category was trained and sourced through the Corale Verdi, a local amateur group created in 1905, 4 years after the death of Giuseppe Verdi, and still active today. The Corale has nurtured operatic musical culture for well over a century. But as I mentioned, the main link between the Corale, Verdi and the Opera House consisted, as Laura Faelli and various other members of the Corale told me, in supplying singers for the chorus of the Teatro Regio. The Corale was the chief source of the Opera House's chorus. Who were these members of the Corale who transited into the chorus of the Teatro Regio? They were people with a day job. I interviewed electricians, factory workers, union representatives, and school teachers. They would take part in theater rehearsals, mostly in the evening, tells me Laura, because we all worked. This system came abruptly to an end in the year 2000, when, probably in preparation of the Verdi's celebrations of 2001, political perspectives and cultural sensitivities changed, and an entirely professional chorus made up of members selected through international auditions was brought in. And as the members of the Corale, this produced the expulsion, kicking out of the old chorus. A similar fluidity mixing professionals and amateurs was shared with other professions within the theatre. Valerio Cervetti, a member of the Club of the 27th, on which I will return, Valerio calls this mixing of professional and amateur elements high-quality dilettantism. I will skip on Valerio's biographical details to focus on what he told me about the Teatro Regio. A peculiarity of the Teatro Regio was this high-quality dilettantism of a theatre where the professional level is not as high as at La Scala or Turin or at the Teatro Comunale in Florence. But there is such a passion for what is done that it communicates to the audience. I call them dilettanti because they were not paid for what they did inside the opera house, but these people knew what they were doing. There was a mix between volunteers and professionals. For instance, the stage manager, who is the person who tells singers when to enter the stage and from where, among many other things, had a different job. He was a carpenter during the day, who turned into a stage manager in the evening. I think this was a real strength of the theatre, and it is sad that this tradition has been lost. But Valerio reports on audience behavior. Parma is famous or infamous in Italy and elsewhere for the fervent reactions of its audiences, which brings me to the last item on my list, audience participation. I turn now to the testimonies of two other members of the Club of the 27. What is the Club of the 27? It's an association of 27 opera lovers. Each of them takes the nickname of one of Giuseppe Verdi's opera. Each member has a seat in a sort of circle which surrounds the bust of Verdi. They meet weekly for collective listening, for in-depth discussions of Verdi's opera librettos and the historical background to each opera. They organize concerts, even within the program of the Festival Verdi, about which Francesco Izzo, one of our guests, will talk later. And they support young singers and run a Verdi Prize for school children every year. The prize is sitting in the royal box of the Teatro Regio for one performance. Yeah. Nicandro Gelati, Nicandro, is one of the most senior members of the club. He shares his first memory of attending opera performances at the Teatro Regio. Together with his elderly cousin, he would cycle to Parma from Roma di Madregolo, a village some 10 kilometers away from the city, so nothing compared to the distance cycled by the mum of Angelo Zanotti. He often endured a 48-hour queue to get the cheapest tickets for the Loggione, the upper gallery. When the singer was an absolute celebrity, such as Franco Corelli, who appeared in 1967 in La Forza del Destino, the queue could start as early as 6 days before the performance. Gelati describes the rituals of queuing outside the theatre. So well-known characters would take charge of the queue. The fires would be lit with wooden boxes left over from the street market of the day to warm up the freezing sit-ins during the night. He tells me, at a certain point, the theatre management took pity on us. And decided to open the theatre ground floor atrium so that we could wait inside, not under the rain or in the snow. Once the doors to the Loggione were open, the queuing crowd, a number ticket in hand, because the seats were not numbered, would rush up to the stairs in order to secure the best seats. Let us dig a bit on the actual aesthetic experience of these people who were listening to the performance from the cheapest and most uncomfortable seats in the house. Giuseppe Amenta, another member of the club of the 27, sat in the Loggione for the first time in 1965, aged 18, for a performance of Verdi's Hernani with American baritone Corner McNeil. Giuseppe emigrated to Parma from Matera, the deep south of Italy, at 13. For 3 years he trained as a nurse while working in a glass factory. As soon as he started working as a nurse, he could finally afford his first Loggione ticket, after having duly queued for it, of course. He describes me the Logionista's behavior, the person who sits in the Loggione. The Logionista have no pretensions to watch the show. They stand at the back of the gallery and comes forward now and then just to glance at the stage. Logionistas listen. For the true hard Logionistas I met, attending an operatic performance meant essentially listening. So, I comment, but what about the acting, the visual element, the drama? He replies wittingly, but they felt it in the voice. They, the Logionistas, listen standing up for the entire duration of the opera while expressing their verdicts. Giuseppe mimics them. He or she, referring to the singer on stage, should have done this. There, he should have done that. And, he tells me, we are talking of people with no education, but very well prepared on the dramatic content of the opera and with a fantastically well-trained ear. But I object again. What were the criteria of their verdicts? He replies again with his knowing smile. verdicts were based on what they heard great singers do in previous occasions, and they had listened to a lot of great singers. As we go deeper into the argument, Maria Callas, Renata Tebaldi, Mario del Monaco, and again Alfredo Kraus, Franco Corelli, Carlo Bergonzi, all the great singers of the past are named. As a historian of singing and singers, I'm intrigued. What did the Logionista, this ultimate opera lover, discuss back in the days when they engaged in their heated conversation about the merits and flaws of great opera singers? To shed some light on this, I need to go back to Nicandro's testimony. Nicandro loved two tenors, Alfredo Kraus and Carlo Bergonzi. He listened to all of Bergonzi's performances at the Teatro Regio until Bergonzi stopped appearing there after he was booed in Aida. He was booed because he sang the top B flat of Celeste Aida, the first aria of Radames in Act 1, pianissimo, using a soft sound, a falsettone, a sort of head voice, which is exactly what Verdi prescribed the singer to do on the score. But it is not what tenors have been doing. The tradition, in fact, is to sing a crescendo to fortissimo on that B flat, thus intensifying the volume of the voice to its maximum power. Bergonzi, comments my interviewee Nicandro, did not have the top notes of a Corelli or the ringing quality, the metallic resonance of a del Monaco. But for me, when he interpreted Verdi's role, for me, it was unsurpassable. Nicandro also expatiates on Alfredo Kraus. Kraus's Werther, referring to the opera by Massenet, was a made-to-measure suit. He entered the character, and when somebody who did not like him criticized him, then arguments would arise. Based on the material I assembled during these early stages of my research, it seems to me that Logionista were discussing something that has been at the heart of operatic culture for a very long time. The quality of individual singers' voice, Corelli's shining top notes, Del Monaco's ringing tone, and singers' ability to use their voice to create words of enhanced human experience, Kraus's made-to-measure Werther. These discourses about singers and about voice have been in circulation since the inception of the art form until very recently. To conclude, my interviewees provide a quite unusual account of operatic life in Italy, but one which I suspect resonates with other parts of the world, since for centuries opera has been a global art form, which relies on similar systems of production and consumption. But Alexandra Wilson will shortly tell us more about this and the British landscape after myself. My interviewees have constantly co-produced operatic culture, and their presence has been as vital and perhaps more vital than that of patrons, critics, and educated elites. After debating on the virtues and defects of their favorite singers, Logionistas ate Parma's fantastic cold cuts and Parmesan's cheese while drinking wine from the region del Lambrusco in the halls behind the Logione during the intervals, which were more than one. What a feast that must have been. Heated discussion on subjects that mattered to them did not erase their ability to be together as a community, sharing the food that they all brought from home. Perhaps there is more than one lesson to be learned here about the inclusivity of opera. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Barbara. That was a really fascinating talk. So now is your chance, audience. Do you have any questions for Barbara? Don't all go at once. Sally, can I give you the mic, Sally? Thanks.
Hello, Barbara. Thank you for that very entertaining and interesting talk. Can you tell us how many singers did you speak to in the Casa da Verdi about their experiences?
Yeah, of course. Thanks for the question, Sally. It was, I talked to around 13 people. Most of them are from working class background or low, what I could define as lower middle class. Some of them are really elderly, 93, 94, so their memories go back a long while, especially the ones that, there are some people who have really strong, lucid memories. And they tell you about all sorts of interesting things, what was their relationship to conductors and directors, how it changed. Those were really important years when opera, the way of making opera changed quite a lot from, the opera based on singing and singers and the figure of the celebrity singer to a different conception where the voice was not absolutely central, acting increasingly became more important, and the director vision, of course. But Bianca Maria Casoni, who has been a very international career mezzo-soprano, she worked with Zeffirelli, Estrella, all the great. And she told me that when was about the soloist singer having to do something on stage, Zeffirelli would ask them, would follow them and explain, I will place you here. Could you sit? Are you comfortable if you sit? Or do you prefer hold a different position? So they were extremely attentive to the profession and the artistry of the singer. And she complained that was changing a lot towards the end of her career. That's just one particular detail.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Hi. Just a question about the Loggianista. Did you ask them about any new operas that came and how they reacted to any new works that came into the theatre?
I didn't ask, but thanks for the question. Very interesting question. I didn't ask, but they wanted to tell me. And let's say that it's a mixed basket, because you have people who are really interested to everything. They would go to a symphonic concert and they would be eager to listen to new things. And there are people who are really conservative and they would go and listen just because they would go and listen to everything. So there was the new thing, they would go, but they are quite, their tone is quite, it's not very enthusiastic, let's put it that way.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We probably have time for one last question, if we have one.
I believe you spoke to an American singer who started her career in, I think was born in Detroit or somewhere, and then travelled to Italy to study and ended up singing Luigi Nono or something like that. And
Mary Lindsay.
Yeah.
Mary
Maybe you could
Lindsay.
say a bit about her.
Mary Lindsay, yeah, she's an American black singer from Detroit, and she had this amazing career singing contemporary operas mainly, associated herself with the greatest Italian contemporary opera composers. And oh my gosh, she's so gracious. And she also taught at the Conservatoire in Brescia. Well, of course, it's another mindset. Her idea of operatic repertoire is far more flexible, and heterogeneous as compared to what an Italian singer, let's say, from 80 and 90-year-old can think about opera. So it's a different outlook. Thanks for the question. I couldn't really. I mean, I would have loved to have all the singers from Casa Verdi in this talk, but it really wasn't a possibility.
Thank you, Barbara. There's so much to explore there, and we can continue the conversation in the break and hopefully also at the drinks at the end. So can we thank Barbara again for a really wonderful talk?
I'm still here, not because I want to be here, but because I wanted to set up Alex's slide.
So I'm going to introduce, thank you, Barbara, Professor Alexandra Wilson now. Alexandra Wilson is a Senior Research Fellow at Jesus College, Oxford, and a Research Resident at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama. She has taught at Oxford Brookes University for 19 years, latterly as Professor of Music and Cultural History. Her new book is called Someone Else's Magic, Opera and
Music.
the British.
Music.
Someone Else's Music. Apologies. Someone Else's Music, Opera and the British, and it's about to be published by Oxford University Press. Alexandra's writing about music can be found in many newspapers, magazines, and online platforms, and she can be heard regularly on BBC Radio 3 and 4.
Thank you.
Welcome, Alexandra Wilson.
Thank you. I'm very grateful to Barbara for inviting me today. Focusing on today's theme of building opera communities, I thought I would keep things local. So I'm going to talk to you about various strategies that were used in the past to build audiences by ENO's predecessors, the Old Vic and Sadler's Wells, as well as the early ENO itself. And everything that follows does come from the book, Someone Else's Music, that you've just heard about. It's a book that traces British attitudes towards opera over the last century, recounting a rich, forgotten history of popular opera going. A century ago, there was no perception here that opera was elitist in the modern sense. Yes, opera was regarded as foreign and often mocked as rather silly or rather strange, but the audience for opera was large and diverse. In the late Victorian and early Edwardian eras, touring companies had transformed opera from a form of entertainment primarily for a London-based elite into a form of popular entertainment that travelled around the country. By the interwar period, opera sat within the middle-brow entertainment ecology. People were happy to go to an opera one night, a film the next, and perhaps to watch dog racing the night after that. Opera was regularly front-page news, and everybody had a good laugh when they read about the latest antics of whichever international diva was in town. Opera was fun, and opera was fashionable. And once given a taste of it, people wanted more, people of all classes. For much of the 20th century, the audience for opera included, amongst others, factory workers, coal miners, soldiers, secretaries, and school children. And they were even willing to queue overnight for cheap tickets, certainly for 2 or 3 nights, maybe not for 6. People who knew nothing about opera encountered it in various ways, through stories in the papers, recordings, broadcasts, and at school. They encountered it in the accompaniment to films, in music halls and variety performances, and on the street, played by organ grinders. But opera companies also took active steps to forge new audiences, and in my talk today, I'll show you some examples of their marketing strategies. We begin our story a century ago in the 1920s, when Lillian Bayliss, whose endeavours form the backdrop to the present ENO, was busy establishing her opera company at the Old Vic. Bayliss's aunt, Emma Cons, had established a reputable, respectable, alcohol-free music hall at the Victoria Theatre in Southwark in the late 19th century, with the aim of diverting locals from a life of drink, violence and vice. Eventually, Bayliss herself took over the institution and began to put on opera performances. First of all, just tableaus of arias strung together in a sequence, later full-length operas in English, and these alternated with performances of Shakespeare plays. Baylis achieved what might now seem to be the impossible. She managed to establish a new audience for opera where there had been none, among working-class South Londoners. Accessibility was the watchword of the Old Vic. The cheapest tickets cost no more than a packet of cigarettes or a glass of beer. The company announced in 1920 that we feel that the People's Theatre and Opera must always be within the reach of the poorest, and as long as the most expensive seat is 3 shillings and the cheapest 3p, we know the Vic is fulfilling its proper function. The 2,000-seat theatre was packed out nightly, and the audience stood 4 or 5 deep in standing areas, with many people being turned away on Saturdays. The atmosphere was relaxed, people came in their ordinary work clothes and clapped after arias. As the company said in that same year, given opera in their own language and at prices suited to a modest purse, the rank and file of English men and women are as keen on opera as any foreign audience. It has to be said that performance standards were not very high. Everything was run on a shoestring. Soloists were paid a pittance, the chorus was made up of enthusiastic amateurs, rehearsals were minimal, performances static and slapdash. Nevertheless, the company was musically ambitious and garnered respect from prestigious figures within the musical establishment, pioneering in particular the performance of Mozart operas in Edward Dent's accessible new translations. Baylis believed fervently in opera for all. She argued that theatre was not an excuse for wonderful evening gowns and jewels, or the preserve of varsity men and women. Rather, it was, quote, a crying need of working men and women who need to see beyond the 4 walls of their offices, workshops and homes into a world of awe and wonder. Baylis believed theatre was the most accessible art form, being comprehensible even to the illiterate, and stated that all art is a bond between rich and poor, it allows of no class distinctions. But she also believed in giving people what was good for them, at least what she believed was good for them, saying, my people must have the best. The best, God tells me the best, is grand opera. Therefore, my people must have grand opera. Grand opera was the term just used for any serious opera at this time. The example of the Old Vic resolutely counters any notion that opera was the preserve of an elite. As the company's conductor, Charles Corrie, observed, the musical side of our work here is supported mainly by people who have not too many pennies to spend on amusement, and apparently choose opera because it gives them the greatest diversion. In fact, it might almost be said that British music in general is mainly supported by the workers. It's for such people that we cater, and it's a great honour to do so, for the future of British music lies in their hands. There's plenty in the daily papers about the lost cause of opera, but I wish some of the gentlemen who write about it would look in some Saturday night at the Old Vic. Some audience members came seeking refuge from their abysmal dwellings, but went on to take opera very seriously indeed. By the 20s, critics regularly commented on the fact that the Old Vic had the most committed and well-informed audience in town. How did Baylis achieve this? Undoubtedly, some of her audience would have been patrons of the old music hall and simply stayed loyal to the brand. But later, the theatre fulfilled a desire for something entertaining to do at a time when options were fewer than they were today, on offer at low price. But crucial to the expansion of the operation was the sense of community Baylis fostered, which encouraged people to return. The idea that opera audiences seek to exclude others from their special club is one of the persistent cliches that's attached itself to the art form, but nothing could have been further from the truth at the Old Vic. The fostering of operatic communities can be both exclusive and inclusive, creating the sense that audience members could become part of the Old Vic family was a vital part of ensuring the endeavour felt accessible to all. This was achieved via a variety of means. First, the company petitioned the audience on which works it wanted to hear. Thus, the audience helped shape the programme and felt it owned a stake in the company. This cooperative approach was also taken by the various touring companies that operated in this period. Second, audiences were invited to pay a small subscription to join the Old Vic Circle and take part in social events with singers, managers and other enthusiasts. Most notable was the cutting of the 12th night cake, an annual celebration that took place on stage, featuring music making, storytelling, and a grand parade to Verdi's triumphal march from Aida by cast and audience members around the theatre. I'm imagining a sort of conga. This custom would survive for decades, and as time went on, the Old Vic Circle would organise many fancy dress parties, parties for children, and social events for the elderly. The Old Vic magazine, circulation 3,000 copies a month by 1926, helped to foster the feeling of a family organisation by publishing birth, marriage and death notices for company personnel. It also published regular articles in which singers chatted about their passion for football or talked about the trades they would have entered had they not been discovered as singers. The fact that the Old Vic was organised on repertory lines, using a regular troupe of unstarry singers whom listeners saw as friends, was a crucial factor in fostering a loyal local audience. In 1931, Bayliss decided to replicate the model. It's frozen up. It's gone to sleep. Just try this. Yep. Okay, thank you. Bayliss decided to replicate the model at Sadler's Wells in Clerkenwell. Eventually, it was decided that shifting sets and costumes between these two theatres was getting rather too much. So they concentrated the opera at Sadler's Wells and the Shakespeare at the Old Vic. But for now, it was both. The theatre was packed in January 1931 for the first production there of Carmen. Bayliss had found an audience ready and waiting at Rosebery Avenue, including many young men, apparently, of about 19 or 20 who were new to opera. Again, it sounds impossible. Again, novelty must have been a factor, but Bayliss was also able to profit from a row about the first embryonic public subsidy for opera that was engulfing Covent Garden. Sadler's Wells, by contrast, showed not only that opera could be accessible, but that it could be commercial and self-funding. Soon, however, the company would start to struggle as the Depression began to bite. Innovative means of promoting performances were tried. Regular supporters were encouraged to drum up audiences by giving tickets to overworked friends or to buy them as birthday gifts. Some patrons were busy distributing flyers on tube trains or sneaking them into library books. It was a hit-and-miss approach, but who knows whether it might have worked. Again, Bayliss managed to foster a sense of community and of opera as something authentic. The Listener reported that operas are produced there in such a way that the public feels they are real living works of art and not museum pieces. Historian Daniel Snowman recalls his father talking about going to Sadler's Wells after a day's work at an insurance office, growing to love opera and building up a treasured collection of gramophone records to get to know them better. And this willingness to study the operas at home and come to performances well prepared was typical of the audiences at Bayliss's theatres. She profited from tapping into a wider culture of working-class autodidacticism that prevailed in this period but would be lost in later decades. During the war, Sadler's Wells was repurposed as a refuge for the newly homeless, accommodating up to 250 people on mattresses in the stalls and bars and on the stage. The Vic Wells Company relocated to Burnley and from there embarked on a series of extensive national tours run by the soprano Joan Cross. From 1943, these were organised in collaboration with CEMA, the Council for the Encouragement of the Arts, the forerunner to the Arts Council. Towns and cities clamoured for visits. The manager of the whole new theatre reported receiving daily letters from people who were keen to see the troupe. Occasionally, they would return to London for one-off short runs during the war, performing in the West End. In the regions, Sadler's Wells and other touring companies were able to profit from sheer demand for entertainment when there was not much else to do during the war. Joan Hammond, soprano, on tour with the Carl Rosa, recalled an occasion when a woman came to the box office, asked what was on, went away with 2 tickets despite not even knowing what an opera was. The audience for operatic music more broadly was further widened by wartime concerts featuring opera singers, organised by CEMA, in air raid shelters, hostels, hospitals, military bases and in factories. Many accounts from the time attest to a new and surprising surge of interest in the high arts during the war. Serious times demanded serious art. The company relaunched itself in London for the post-war age by staging the premiere of Britain's Peter Grimes. This certainly galvanised interest, with tickets selling out in 3 days. The choice of opera was a deeply symbolic gesture. Later, in 1948, opera writer Stephen Williams would reflect that Peter Grimes had been born not merely with a silver spoon in its mouth, but a whole canteen of cutlery, as an opera on an English subject by an English composer, which appeared at the most opportune of moments, when there was post-war euphoria and an emerging new audience for opera. Its success in drawing the crowds was astonishing, and it showed what a democratic sort of opera could look like. Opera was only inaccessible in the 1950s to the extent that not enough performances could be put on to meet high demand. Sadler's Wells was regularly full, and demand was particularly high for the cheapest seats, particularly from young listeners. It continued to bill itself as the People's Theatre and launched a new cheap ticket scheme for 15 to 25-year-olds. By 1968, the company was able to announce that half of its audience was under 35. The company was thriving so much that there was confident talk in the 60s of Sadler's Wells moving to a new National Opera House beside the National Theatre, but escalating costs of the South Bank project meant the plan never came to fruition. But in 1968, the company decided instead to move up west to the Coliseum where we are today, a move it hoped would allow itself to gain greater prominence and attract a larger audience. The company gave its last performance at Sadler's Wells on the 15th of June 1968, which was fittingly Peter Grimes, and then the move to the Coliseum came in August with a Don Giovanni directed by Sir John Gielgud and designed by Derek Jarman. The first performance was a sellout, the house crammed to the last seat and the last half-inch of standing room. The Coliseum was a theatre with an appropriately populist past, designed by Frank Matcham for the music hall impresario Oswald Stoll, and intended to be the largest and grandest variety hall of its era, which had latterly been used as a widescreen cinema. On the day of the move, the Daily Mirror flagged up the theatre's roots in popular culture, reporting that the arias of Mozart will tonight soar happily above the stage trodden by Vesta Tilley and Lily Langtry, and a theatre will be reborn, and reminding readers that this was the venue that had staged many a popular triumph, from Sarah Bernhardt to Annie Get Your Gun. We might have expected a tabloid newspaper to remark on the event with a degree of humour or cynicism, mockery even, but the move was reported without side. This article concluded simply by stating that the new premises would give more people an opportunity to see good opera. The popular press did not at this time filter all comments about opera through the lens of elitism. Suddenly there were far more seats to fill, 2,400 rather than 1,450. The company promised to keep 2,000 tickets at present Finsbury prices. The remainder would be more expensive, but still cheaper than the equivalent at Covent Garden. There was certainly great public interest. £45,000 was taken in advance bookings, and by April 1969, the company was reporting an increase in attendance of almost 50% compared with the last season at Sadler's Wells. The company also hoped to attract new types of people to the opera. Relocating had the disadvantage of moving away from that loyal local audience. But in a more prominent situation, the theatre would be able to attract curious passers-by and tourists, including people who might usually go to see musicals. The managing director, Stephen Arlen, wanted to make the Coliseum the theatre in which newcomers to opera learn about the medium. Most importantly, his aim was to, quote, bring home to a carpenter or a motor mechanic that opera is not some strange minority right, but a play with music, and good tuneful music too, and to attract a public that's never seen opera before, people who have thought of opera as snob art. In its new setting then, Sadler's Wells was returning to first principles, reviving the aspirations of Baylis, but now in the West End. Going to ENO, as it was called from 1974, remained cheap and accessible in the 1970s. Though the company sometimes had to increase ticket prices, it was at pains to stress its desire to keep them as low as possible. There were various discount schemes, 30% off in the balcony for regulars, group reductions for parties of children, and deals where a good seat could be combined at reasonable price with dinner at a restaurant or rail travel. As Opera magazine reported in 1945, let it never be forgotten that you can get into the gallery at the Coliseum for less than it costs at any cinema within a mile radius, a luxury Londoners should beware of taking for granted. And as at the Old Vic half a century earlier, ENO supplemented its performances with a range of activities to make audiences feel more involved. From the early 70s, audiences could attend lunchtime at the Coliseum events, featuring a talk by a notable figure from the opera world with a light lunch. By the end of the decade, there was a more formalised opera in-depth programme run by the University of London Extramural Studies Department. Members of an affiliated group called the Opera Club had the opportunity to attend rehearsals and parties, if not to do the conga around the auditorium. And children were invited to design the sort of poster that would encourage them to come and see La Cenerentola in a competition that offered tickets, art materials and dinner at the Café Royal as a prize. More direct participation was also encouraged. Around 100 children a year performed in ENO performances by the mid-70s. And ENO Workshop Opera was a scheme where people, adults as well, around the country could take part in specially devised new works, accompanied by tape recorder and synthesizer. And on the main stage at the Coliseum, contemporary works on a larger scale were also aired, with the Earl of Harwood keen to promote new works. And a particularly striking commission was David Blake and Anthony Ward's Toussaint, about Toussaint Louverture, the leader of the Haitian Revolution. ENO was keen to emphasise the same sorts of populist credentials that had been underpinning the enterprise since the Old Vic days. Although advertisements in company programmes often played on the stereotypical trappings of opera going with images of champagne bottles and glasses, the company's own publicity looked rather different. An ENO calendar from 1979 featured an advert with Groucho Marx, boasting a night at the opera isn't all it's cracked up to be, informing readers that you don't have to speak Italian, own a dinner jacket or drink champagne, and that 90p bought you a seat at the Collie, where all the best operas come in English. Meanwhile, a booklet published in 1980, reflecting on the first few years of ENO, wrote of an audience made up of both a regular core, intimately familiar with the company's work and eager to applaud its favourite singers, and a more casual crowd, attracted by the theatre's accessibility and to the company by consistent standards of good entertainment. As this suggests, by this time, ENO had built up a distinctively loyal audience, once again, that was inquiring and adventurous. Unusual operas put on here in the late 1970s included Ginastera's Bomazzo, which did well at the box office, and Smetana's Dalibor, which did not. Operas such as Werther, From the House of the Dead, The Adventures of Mr. Bruchek, which would be considered rarities now, were also staple fare. Absolutely vital to this was the fact that it was a repertory company. Audience members came back repeatedly because they felt an affection for a particular group of performers. And having hooked listeners in by that means, the company had the freedom to experiment artistically because audiences were willing to give new things a go. Between 1986 and 1990, audiences for opera here in the UK increased more than for any other art form, with a particularly dramatic rise in interest among the young. ENO's managing director, Peter Jonas, stated that opera has never known such demand. With large amounts of opera in film soundtracks, CD sales booming, and even performances in rock stadiums by the 1980s, it had become fashionable, and ENO's Jonas went so far as to argue in 1990 that the whole argument that it is elitist is now obsolete. Unfortunately, this would not turn out to be true. The elitism stereotype, a fashionable idea that began to circle in the 1980s and that was perpetuated incessantly by a lazy media across the coming decades, meant that all opera companies would struggle in the years to come, having to fight their way over the artificial hurdles of negative perception. The idea that opera is elitist, fueled so determinedly in recent decades, comes from a combination of factors: simple ignorance, a lazy idea of picnickers in black tie and overweight divas in horned helmets, but also a range of partisan ideological agendas. I don't have time to discuss these here, though I examine them at great length in my forthcoming book, but for now we can say at least that the elitism stereotype is destructive rather than constructive. It closes doors and it closes minds, and it is intimately linked to the challenges ENO faces today, including with funding. The circumstances in which ENO and all other opera companies in the UK have to attract audiences in the 21st century, indeed fight for their survival, are completely changed from the examples I've been discussing today. Nevertheless, perhaps there are a few useful strategies from the past that might be worth resurrecting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. That was so interesting. And to your final point, I think there's actually some striking similarities between some of the things that we're doing engaging with audiences today and that of the past, but also much that we can learn. So thank you. Who would like to ask Alexandra a question? Yeah.
I can speak loud.
Oh, it's for the recording.
Okay.
We need you on the mic. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been around this planet for many, many years, and it's very interesting watching the evolution of the voice that's accepted by the average person. Growing up, the operatic voice was the norm. I mean, you know, in the movies, you had Lawrence Melchior singing, Deanna Durbin had that voice, and my God, Jeanette MacDonald took over in the 30s and early 40s, and she sang opera, like in San Francisco, she sings San Francisco, and she was singing Faust. And this was normal. And absolutely normal. And in fact, in the 50s, the battle between Tebaldi and Callas was something people talked about. Opera was something that people talked about and enjoyed. And we had the voices, Catherine Grayson. They had these amazing voices that were standard. And even musical theater, you had more the operatic sound there. And this has faded away now. And this is, I find this is not, that voice is not as accepted as it once was. I mean, you go to musical theater today, and you hear the voices that are not like what you heard, you know, in the 1950s or 60s, even the Ethel Merman kind of voice, which was not operatic, but was the major voice there. And it seems to, the whole, you know, sociology, I mean, of all this has seemed to change in terms of what young people like. Truthfully, I don't understand it, but I'm an old man, and I lived through those wonderful years ago when you heard, a Jeanette MacDonald come up in that glorious voice, and it was magnificent, and Catherine Grayson singing in Showboat. I mean, these are wonderful moments that I experienced, but it no longer is there. It's a whole different way of thinking in today's society. And I think this is one of the reasons why operas have declined, because it was central in the 40s, 50s, 30s, and then it declined beginning in the 60s that I found. Mm. And could you comment on any of this because of that voice?
Thank you. That's really touching to hear that. Yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. And it's all to do with a lack of exposure, isn't it? The fact that opera has fallen out of the mainstream of our entertainment, and it's to do with, you know, opera used to be much more visible to people in daily life. I mean, you still find opera in popular culture in various ways, in film and television references, plenty of references to opera, but it doesn't have the prominence it used to have. I mean, there was a lot more of it on the television. Astonishing amounts of opera on television in the 70s, particularly, though going on into the 80s. I mean, I begin my chapter of my book about the 1970s by talking about how ITV wanted to put Verdi's Macbeth on Christmas night. And they had to backtrack. There was too much of an uproar. They did have to push it back by a few nights. But, you know, it was on after the Benny Hill show. But, you know, the general opportunities to encounter opera on television, on radio, and in schools. You know, there's a huge amount of opera in schools in the 50s and the 60s, children putting on their own operas. Of course, all that's gone. And so, yes, I suppose over the years, that voice has come to be seen as something strange, something rarefied, rather than something that you would hear on a more everyday basis.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm just getting past you. Thank you. Hi, can you go into a bit more detail about what you think the causes might have been for suddenly having a lazy media and the whole narrative around what opera was in society changing so dramatically and so quickly?
Well, I mean, it's a very, very complicated story unpicking why, when and how opera came to be seen as elitist. And I do look at this over the course of a whole century, and there are many, many different strands to it. There are arguments about money, about who goes to the opera, about all sorts of different aspects to it, about opera houses and many different facets to that, and whether opera is something intellectual, etc. But really the elitism stereotype starts to get going in earnest in the sense that we would recognise it now from the 1980s. The term elitism is only a term that starts to be used at all in the late 70s. You won't find it in a dictionary before then. Elite before then is entirely a positive term. And there was a period when elitism was used positively as well. So for a company to be elitist is a good thing because that means a high standard. But as time goes on, that word becomes entirely pejorative. Very often these things are fashions. In the 1980s, it just gets picked up as a buzzword. And then, buzzwords just kind of spread. And this is in the time before social media, of course, when things spread even quicker, ways in which people talk. But I suppose one journalist starts talking about it and one interviewer starts talking about it, and then it just kind of snowballs. And it's people at dinner parties would be talking about is what we're doing terribly elitist. And it just becomes the default thing to say over the 80s and the 90s. Now, there are certain things that happen in the operatic world in the 90s that don't help. So, for example, there's that big furore, which some of you may remember in the mid-90s, about the lottery grant to the Royal Opera House. And also they did a fly-on-the-wall documentary called The House, which was a terrible piece of PR that went wrong. So there were things that really the press were able to latch onto around that time to say, look, we told you so, opera's elitist. It just becomes, I think, a thing that journalists said about opera when they didn't know anything else about it. So they would be interviewing someone from the opera world. The interviewer probably didn't know a lot about opera, but they did know that people said it was elitist. So it became sort of the first thing anyone within the opera world had to kind of get past before they could talk about what they wanted to talk about. And I think that by around the year 2000, that idea was just so deeply ingrained that by that time it had spun out of control and it almost becomes impossible to combat. Yes.
Have you considered in your research the comparison with European opera, where there is still much more going on? Some of its trends are the same, but maybe one big difference, of course, is the level of public subsidy is much higher. So is that a contributor to this decline, and therefore probably just a question of timing, as that probably will decline? Or are there other factors, cultural factors, to do with education at school, etc.?
There's a lot there. I'll do what best I can. My project that turned into this book is British in Focus, and the reason for that is because people have often asked me, why don't you talk about whether opera is elitist everywhere? That's because if you're going to look at an issue over a long period of time, if you're going to stretch the focus chronologically, if you also stretch it geographically, it becomes too diffuse. And also I feel that every country has its own distinct cultural history of opera, and you couldn't generalise about that. And I think one of the problems that we have now is that attitudes towards there's a new strand playing into the opera elitism stereotype that's coming from the USA. The USA has had a very different relationship with opera, and their terms of reference around opera are not the same, and yet suddenly the American views of opera being elitist are playing into what's being said here. So that's problematic. Here and there, I touch on comparisons with Europe. Obviously, generally speaking, it's a sort of friendlier environment for opera, although I'm sure that's a gross generalisation. As for funding, yes, I mean, in the States, there's public subsidy is not the model of funding opera. It's more benevolent giving and so on. And the idea that opera is elitist there is very pronounced. Not the same as here, but probably worse. In Europe, there's been much more public subsidy for opera, and the hostility to opera is less. And yet, one of the things I talk about in this great long journey through the history of opera in this country is that when the Labour government at the beginning of the 1930s tried to introduce subsidy for opera, there was a public outcry, and the papers latched onto this, and you saw the beginnings of the elitism stereotype popping up with really snide comments about who's this for, this is for a tiny number of posh people, which was wrong, which wasn't how things were, but that stereotype was sort of being fueled by mischievous journalists at that time. And yet when opera was properly subsidised after World War II, at that particular moment, there was a great warmth of feeling for the idea of operatic subsidy and subsidy for the arts in general. So I think it just depended on the particular historic moment, because obviously the beginning of the 1930s is the height of the Depression. That was a terrible time to try to launch the first, not only the first operatic subsidy, but the first subsidy for any art form in this country. So these questions of money and subsidy do play into this.
Oh, yes. Following on from what this gentleman was just saying, there are two things I'd like to say. I was a professional opera singer for many, many years, and it was in the 80s and the 90s and the zeros, and I always felt it was very elitist. For example, here in this country, if somebody asked me, what do you do for a living? I said, well, I'm an opera singer, and I was hit with a total silence. And they said, yeah, but what do you do for a living? Whereas you would understand this when I was in Italy, people would ask me and I'd say, io canto la lirica. I sing opera. And they would go, oh, ma sei un artista, you're an artist. And they loved it. And it is a culture here that I feel is still terribly strong. And it's still going on. I mean, I was in Maui for various reasons. My sister lives there. This Christmas, and people said to me, "What do you like?" I said, "Oh, opera," and they thought I was talking about Oprah Winfrey. It didn't occur to them that there was anything else. And when I said, "No, opera," and it was like blank. You could see there was a total blank going on. So this is just a comment of what this gentleman was saying. The other thing I actually wanted to say was I really do strongly feel that a reason that people are not coming to opera is that everything is put into a musical now. And the musicals are easy listening, and it doesn't matter what story it is, it's better as a play, but they still plonk it into a musical, which is normally sung by terrible singers, sorry, but it is, and they've all got microphones, so they don't need to know how to sing, and it's not necessarily particularly good music, but there you are, that's what people want to go to, and this is still elitist, and we still hit that, and I'm sure the ENO know perfectly well that here the things that have done terribly well are when they've put musicals on. So this is the sad thing, I think.
Have I got time to say anything, or do we need to move?
Thank you.
The point about people looking at you blank faces, I mean, although I'm showing this kind of rich history of popular democratic opera going, of course, there's still, that's kind of clashing with the ongoing idea that opera is foreign and un-British, which goes back to the beginnings of opera arriving in this country in the 18th century and still persists today. And there are plenty, I mean, just countless people saying opera is it's a hothouse plant in this country. It's a kind of foreign flower, like an orchid that's got to be carefully tended. It doesn't belong here. It's not native to this country. All this is ongoing, or all kinds of funny metaphors around opera. So yes, there's always going to be, British Philistinism as part of this. Yeah. As for musicals, yeah, I mean, opera's had to fight against film and musicals for a long time, competing for attention. But I'm not really sure what the answer to that is.
Thank you so much for your questions, and thanks again, Alexandra. It was a brilliant talk. So we are now going to have a break. If you could come back here for just after 4 p.m, we will start at sharp at 4:05. So we'll have tea and coffee in the Sky Bar, which is just down these stairs here, or you can take the lift. And yeah, thank you so much again to Barbara and Alexandra, and see you shortly. Welcome back, everybody. Hope you had a nice cup of tea or coffee. So we come to the second part of our afternoon today, and we have a round panel conversation on the topic of opera, communities and connection. So I'm going to introduce our chair, Carol Leeming, and then each person on the panel is going to introduce themselves and their practice, and talk to us about something that they want to highlight in relation to the topic. So, Carol Leeming, MBE FRSA, is an internationally acclaimed music artist, hailed by academics as a polymath, a multi-award winning, multidisciplinary artist in literature, performing arts and digital media. Carol is a published poet, playwright, director, composer, singer-songwriter, actor and filmmaker, vocal coach, curator and journalist. Carol is currently resident artistic director at Curve Theatre in Leicester and associate writer-director at Playground Theatre in West London. Carol has an incredibly impressive array of recent work, and I suppose one thing I'd like to highlight particularly is that you've been dramaturg for Streetwise Opera Company on the work Chips Off the Old Block, and you have worked in a number of different sectors, as well as equalities, health and well-being. Carol's company, Dare to Diva, was established in 2002 and is currently developing an original contemporary chamber opera. So it's a real pleasure to have you here hosting the panel discussion, Carol, and you're here today on behalf of your work with Black Lives in Music.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yes. Well, it's absolutely delightful to be here today and to see all of you at this wonderful event. We had a really rich first part, and I'm sure you're going to be really looking forward to the second part, this very important conversation that we're having. So I just want to do something that I've just been reminded to do. So I am a black woman in my 60s with plaited hair with shells, and my pronouns are she and her. And I would also remind the panel when they do their introductions as well to also give a very brief visual description in terms of accessibility. So, before we start, I just wanted to make share a few thoughts with you. This is going to be very much a safe space. We're hopefully going to have quite a frank and open sharing today, and hopefully we're all going to learn some new things. I just wondered about how we feel in terms of where opera is now and where it is that it might be going to, and how we are going to be thinking about the context of opera and how it operates currently, and to really deeply think about what it is we mean when we want to unpack words like inclusion and connection. So without further ado, I'm going to call on Michael, who's going to introduce himself and tell you about the work that Michael and his organisation does. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Michael McCarthy. I'm the Director of Music Theatre Wales, a company I started back in 1982. So a little bit of history linking up with E&O and that history there, a place I was attending from the early 80s, of course. I'm a late middle-aged white man, him, he. We were touring contemporary opera around the UK, internationally. Beautiful, sometimes rarefied, extraordinary works by composers who were pushing at the boundaries of music and of operatic expression. And by the time we got to 2019, it felt like the wheels were beginning to come off. The touring model was extremely challenging financially. Touring even small-scale contemporary opera meant that we were effectively touring very large-scale theatre. It was a challenge. The audience we had were wonderful, beautiful, fascinating people, but it wasn't changing and it wasn't growing. And the funding model was getting much more challenging. 2019 felt like an existential crisis, and I couldn't quite work out how to change things. I tried to find other ways of pursuing the same model, a model, I should say, that was based on history. It was based on an inheritance from the fires of London and Peter Maxwell Davies, out of which was born in many ways out of English Opera Group and Benjamin Britten. There was a history of this kind of work. So COVID comes along 2020, and in some ways it was kind of perfect timing for us. Guilty to say that, perhaps, but it's true. It gave time to think. The conveyor belt stopped. We could take a deep dive and consider what was the point. And I really did do that. And I felt I was looking around the opera sector, waiting for everybody else to do the same and not really seeing it happen. And then reflected on, well, wait a minute, Music Theatre Wales is a contemporary opera company, and we're following the same model that we'd started 40 plus years earlier. So maybe guilty as charged. So what was the point? And the point was to present opera as a contemporary art form. And therein lies the rub. Contemporary cannot surely be defined simply by contemporary classical music. It has to be defined by society, the world in which we live, the world in which we're meant to be part of, performing to, working with. And we weren't doing that. All of the works that we were commissioning and developing and performing by global artists were pretty much from the same stable. That wasn't changing at all. And yet, if we were meant to be part of contemporary society as contemporary opera makers, surely we should be addressing that. It was very, very evident, of course, in 2020, Black Lives Matter, that there was an issue that was much bigger than opera. There was a societal issue. But opera had a real problem with diversity. That was very, very clear. It is something that we had learnt about when we had our own controversy around a piece called The Golden Dragon in 2017, issues around representation. And when that came up, I was very naive about what that situation was and spent an awful lot of time trying to meet absolutely everybody I could who had protested against the production or what the production was being represented as to discover what the problem was. But by 2020, I'd learnt a lot, but not made any change, not made a difference. So I realized actually there was a purpose. And the purpose was to continue to present opera as a contemporary art form, but to reflect on what the contemporary was. And to look at how we, as a flexible, small-scale, commissioning organisation with a deep understanding and history of commissioning work, how we could make a difference. And that was really about saying, maybe we need to open up to new creators. Maybe we need, as an opera sector, to think about how opera is made and who is making it and who it is for. Maybe we need to find new ways to bring new stories to opera. Maybe we need to find new ways to talk about opera and think about its core identity, storytelling in music. We're not telling those stories. 1 minute. So the way to change things was to think about how we changed the form, how we got flexible about the form. We're not going to get people to just come into opera from the outside and write us an hour-and-a-half long epic to take on tour. That doesn't work. But what you need to do is find ways to engage with people who are natural storytellers in music. So go for short form, go for digital form, go for small-scale touring work, go for work that plays into communities and plays with communities. Go for street art opera, which we're now commissioning and producing. And yes, go for larger scale commissions when it's right and when you've got the artists right and when the stories are right that are waiting to be sung in music. So we live on 3 questions. What is opera? Who is creating it? And who is it for? And if we ask those questions, which I think are not really asked often enough, it has to be said, they're basic, but they're not asked enough. If we ask those questions, we start thinking about what the purpose is and what we can do with it. And I will give you my very brief description of what I feel that the essential opera toolkit is, what keeps it being operatic. And it's telling stories in music where the music is a continuous and fundamental part of that storytelling and dramatic experience, and to use the operatic voice, but not necessarily all the time. Use it when it's meaningful and powerful and beautiful and human. I think opera is a fundamentally universal human activity that we have always done, and we've refined and cultivated into a tiny little space, but it has the capacity to speak to and for everyone.
Thank you. To me.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Timmy Williams. I'm a musician and also an exec producer for Theo, which is a global-led theatre company based in Wales, in Cardiff, Wales. I'm going to start with my description. Thank you very much. I am a 40-year-old black male. My introduction into opera came from my experience with Music Theatre Wales. By Michael. I guess, being a creative, I started singing in a church choir when I was 7, and I carried on up until my teens, and then carried on making more music. I wrote my first opera before I actually saw an opera. I don't know if that baffles you, but it baffled me. As a musician, as a storyteller, as a writer, I've written different types of music. But in 2020, I'll be quite succinct with this and get straight to the point. I was had built this relationship with Michael, and I was introduced to a director, and Cita Thomas, who we were both commissioned to experiment with opera. I predominantly write jazz, Afrobeat, hip-hop music. So coming from that background, I was like, sorry, opera? But I've never gone to see an opera before. I've seen so many live shows in different formats and whatnot. But for me, it was the storytelling aspect that got me excited, and the fact that I was able to express myself vocally, which I enjoyed doing. Long story short, in my life at the time, as a musician, the pandemic happened, and obviously venues were shut. We couldn't mix as much as we could. So the idea was to create a digital piece. I never met this director before. In fact, we didn't even see each other in physical form until the day we were filming this digital piece. So we worked on it for 2 months. What I'm trying to get at here is when we sort of wrote this piece based on what was happening in my life at the time. I started a street food business, a Nigerian street food business, and to make up for the loss of income at the time, and to feed my family. And we decided to write this opera based on that. A Nigerian upcoming chef trying to figure out life, really. And I was just like, I'm writing about a Nigerian chef in opera. Okay, I went online checking, going, there's no one's done this before, and I'm a rapper. I don't really, So interestingly enough, I had to figure out a way of making this. The process was one of the most fascinating processes I've been through in terms of creating. The backing tracks, we couldn't meet up with any live musicians, obviously. So I had to be innovative with it and decided to use my phone and record a lot of the sounds. I'm going to play you a little short 2-minute piece in my last 2 minutes of this, and create the music from. Obviously, this piece is about a chef. From the utensils I've got in the kitchen, basically, from the microwave door shutting to a toaster popping, to me chopping onions and garlic, and I recorded every single thing, even the kettle boiling. And recorded the pop at the end, and used this to make the backing track. As a writer, I collaborated with a singer, and then we created this piece. What was interesting about it, I'll show you in a minute, what was interesting about it is the collaboration, the amalgamation of I guess, hip-hop music, jazz music, and using opera, and trying to figure out how this could work. It was interesting. We were able to write this and I would say successfully experiment in and it came out positively, I would say, considering we filmed in a pandemic and we all had to take our tests in the morning and be at a distance while we're filming. It moved on to after we wrote this piece and I went out. We eventually got more funding by the help of Music Theatre Wales, and we toured it as an actual live piece with live instrumentation, etc. My point here, what I'm here is, I wouldn't have ever considered. And considering the audience that came to these shows, they're all sellouts, by the way. North Wales, West Wales, and South West Wales. National coverage, which was surprising. ITV, BBC, they were there through the rehearsals and etc. But my take on it, which I've now been sort of, I guess, thank you very much, is the fact that I feel that the opera's about storytelling. The people writing, if you were to work in and work with stories that were relevant to or to the community or you're trying to reach out to, and the people writing those stories were from that community, then you will automatically change the people that kind of come to see the shows, which I'd imagine, which I saw, experienced personally. And that's what. So my take on this is about changing the spaces and the people who write these operas, and that would potentially, from my experience and what I've seen, my little experience, grow and keep growing the audience and the people who consume opera.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jimmy.
And this is the two main pieces. Thank you.
See, the door was open, so I moonwalked in. No one to point me in the right direction. My name is Adeola, I wanna be chef. Heard your last cook left, so I best come correct. Hey? Flex that street style vegan jollof plus 3 clean beans that knock your socks off fresh. Heat to the table, scotch bonnets that rock. The house party with mad flavor, the savor. Lemony coleslaw that dampens your taste buds. Sweet plantain from the West African cater. In fact, hey, sorry.
There's a job criteria. I'm the boss lady and I am very pleased to meet ya. For the starters, there's a few things we will need. I would like to see your paperwork, sir, please.
You want paperwork? Geez, I'll show you proof. Self-taught, no beef. Tomato base, so smooth. Grab a plate, fork or spoon, there'll be a delay. African time, what's the way? I'll be with you soon.
Alice and ginger, beans and corn.
Yes.
Aromatic rice. Ooh, that smells so nice.
Thank you.
Can I place an order, please?
I'm sure you can.
And we cut the jollof. And we cut the jollof.
Thank you very much, Jimmy.
Thank you.
Well, I'd like you to go next, please, Alison.
Okay. My name is Alison Buchanan, and I'm the artistic director of Pegasus Opera. I'm a black woman in her over mid, whatever you call it. And today I have big curly hair and big gold earrings. Okay, so.
And your pronouns?
Oh, her, she, those are my pronouns. Okay. There was this white American priest who took over at the High Anglican Church I attended as a young girl in Bedford. In those days, you could expect 10 to 15 congregants on any given Sunday, and maybe up to 50 for Easter and Christmas. When Father J came, some 10 years after I had left, the numbers had stayed consistently small. This beautiful church was in the center of Queen's Park, a noted melting pot of working-class immigrants. Father J arrived, looked around, and proceeded to throw himself into that ecosystem. He started cricket tournaments, taught baseball to the youth, ate everyone's food, went into homes, and took the time to understand each culture represented. Pretty soon, you could not tell the people of Carriacou or Grenada that he wasn't one of them, nor any of the Italians, the South Asians, the Irish, or the Polish. That church soon became full to the rafters and the heartbeat of that community. Jay once told me he would hang out in Bedford's den of iniquity, the West Indian Club, to play dominoes, chat with people, and drink rum. He invited Bedford's 2 big black ministers from the 2 big black churches to come and join him there to engage with people. "Oh no, we can't go to a place like that," they would say. This has always resonated with me and is the driver for our work at Pegasus. We in opera, like the church, have a duty to go to the people and not expect them to miraculously find us, particularly when they feel the message has been, you can come but only if you dress and talk appropriately and fit in. All the perceived barriers, real or imagined, that stop people going to fellowship in either place. What does this mean practically? Why should we care? What does civic engagement look like? At Pegasus, we care about the people. It is not about securing grants. And while on some level it is about putting bums on seats, that is not the why. We do it because we want our communities to have the benefit of the transformative healing power of music, opera, and art. We want them to know we care about them and are not part of the old boy network that precludes them. Opera for the people. The pictures you are seeing are of us in the church in Bedford I mentioned, pictures of us in Bristol, Birmingham, one of our singers sitting to elders in Croydon, and some seemingly very happy kids at learning and participation events. When we began thinking of commissioning an opera, we thought about the story we wanted to tell. Windrush is the story of Britain, about immigrants coming to this country and changing the ecosystem, the culture, and helping to rebuild a country ravaged by war. And so by doing, defining who we are today. It is not a black story. The story belongs to all of us. Last year, we took snippets of our Windrush opera with the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic to Bristol, Liverpool, Birmingham, and London. We decided we would not just rock up, perform, and leave. We began engaging with local communities in each place months before, bringing elders and youth together, having the kids write songs inspired by the elders, which they then performed during the matinee shows. We created an exhibition to reflect the history and the rich narrative of the show, and we wanted to create community ownership in each place. Our narrator talked to the audience in a way that made them feel part of the story. I remember family gatherings as a child, the debates, the laughter, the way of being. After Pegasus's founder died, I struggled initially to connect authentically with our audience. Then I remembered my childhood, and I met the audience there, talking to them in a different way. They became my family in the living room, which felt authentic, comfortable for me and for them. It was familiar and proved to be the missing link. We now perform concerts to sold-out audiences. In those concerts, as well as opera, you will hear music from Africa, South Asia, and recently China in the mix. For us, we know the tone we want to set. Our audience never feel othered. They come, they laugh, they are challenged, they dance, and they return. We create a curiosity and a connection that makes them want to come to a full opera, which might prove a stretch for some of them. But having come to a concert, they will invariably give opera a go. And we ensure that they see themselves reflected on the stage, in the pit, and backstage. We are hoping to do a South Asian tour with South Asian classical music, South Asian Western classical music. And we want to set the tone there as well, because it's not one size fits all. During lockdown, our community choir met virtually, and as it was online, we made it international. We had people joining from around the globe, including Carol from London, who was practically blind. We were eager to make her feel wanted, included, and important. We changed email fonts from 12 to 72. We increased the size of the music. We sent audio learning tools just for her. Then also after choir practice, we would leave the link open for people around the globe to chat and find connection. One meeting, one of the members broke down crying and shared her woes. I loved the way the community of singers supported and encouraged her. Again, it reminded me, singing is never just about singing. It is community, it is coming together, it is harmony. Opera companies increasingly need to think about serving a wider demographic. Even if community efforts do not lead to a huge uptake in sales, we do this to show them that we care. Music has the ability to connect people, and we should want everyone to know that we care about them. I close with a provocation. The current divisive narrative coming from the White House is, unless you fit in, we don't care about you, we don't care about your children, your family, you are irrelevant. Imagine the psychological toll of that. Opera does not wreak such havoc, thankfully, but there is a feeling amongst a large section of this country that we as an industry do not care. Art, music have often been catalysts for change. As leaders in this industry, we have a duty to demonstrate in real ways that we care enough to find the people where they are. We must lead by example and create seeds of change. I urge you all to be community revolutionaries and change makers.
Thank you, Alison. I'd like to turn to Jo now.
Hey. I'm going to do something boring and click through my PowerPoint as I speak.
After you've introduced yourself.
Well, once I've introduced myself. Oh, I can do it from here.
Oh,
I was going to ask you to exchange with Tumi. That's amazing. Which button do I... Oh, it's the arrows. Oh, wow.
Technology.
Sorry. Technology is... Should I check it? Okay. Oh, technology.
So do you want to change with Tumi?
I can swap with Tumi, and then I don't have to keep saying slide. Sorry.
Hold with us, folks. Thank you, Jo.
Right. Hello, everybody. My name's Jo Bedford, and I'm the Community Engagement Manager at Opera North. I'm a white female in my late 30s. I'm going to be 40 next week. New decade. Yeah. What do I need to say? My pronouns are she, her, and I'm wearing some dark glasses. So those talks have been absolutely fantastic and really inspiring and rousing. So mine's probably going to seem a little bit boring in comparison. I'm going to give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour through Opera North's community engagement programme, which is part of our learning and engagement department, which I work for. First of all, to say we're enormous, our team. When I started, we were 5 project managers, and now 15 years later, we are something like 12 project managers and about 34 delivery staff, so it's an enormous department. And in the middle there is community engagement. We are divided into 4 strands of work: higher education, schools programmes, talent development, which is our youth programmes, training for young people, and community engagement. So we're in the middle there. And before I take you through what we do in our community engagement programme. Just take a moment to sort of consider what we mean when we talk about community engagement, because, I mean, in a sense, it's everything we do. Our families are our communities, our schools are our communities, our young people are our communities. But when we're talking about how Opera North is structured in terms of community engagement, this is an adult focus. It's the engagement part of learning and engagement, so informal experiences, accessible experiences. There's a strong focus on health and well-being. It's about going out into communities, meeting people where they are, and not expecting people to always be coming to us. And it's about access and opportunities to experience us as a company and what we have to offer. So very quickly, I'll just say our community engagement programme encompasses, I've gone too far, sorry. Our adult programme, which we have a programme called Melodic Memories, which works with older people and their carers with dementia. And our Sing On programme, which is an informal singing programme for adults who come along to us and take part in learning music and learning choruses together. So it's the focus on that is the social aspect. Then we have our community partnerships. And in that is our Arts Together network, which is a network for organisations working with community groups, arts organisations and third sector organisations who have some form of community offer. And we also have our Encore scheme, which is also for organisations working with any groups experiencing barriers to accessing the arts, and they get free tickets to come and see our performances. And then this is kind of my main area, which is what I'm terming here creative placemaking. I think a lot of people have heard of that. It's a bit of a buzzword. But that's really about the outreach work. That's where we're going out as a company to meet people where they are. And it's about, as it says here, reimagining the impact an opera company can have on their local communities, but also, and this is crucial, the impact those communities can have on us. What can we learn from our communities? It's not a one-way thing. So what that looks like, sorry, I've gone too far again. These are kind of the key hallmarks of that work, which is about really embedding into a community. So it's not about short-term experiences, and there are a place for short-term experiences, but this is much more about the longer term, the relationship we're building with our local communities, and it's about two-way relationships. It's about listening and being led by community, so we're not making decisions based on nothing. We're not pre-planning everything and going in and saying, here's what we're doing, come to this, engage with us. It's, what do you want? How can we serve your community? What would you like your local opera company to do for you? It's about co-creation and collaboration. That is so important. Again, we haven't pre-planned everything. We're working with our communities as equals, as our collaborators, as our colleagues, to work together to do something that is relevant for them. It's about supporting existing activity, and I've referenced here ABCD, which we're interested in, which is asset-based community development, which is about not going into community and looking at it as there's a deficit here and how can we fill that gap. It's what's strong, not what's wrong about this community. It's it's that not top-down approach. It's kind of, no, there's so much here. How can we be part of that, and how can we support that, and work together and enhance that even further? Oh no. So it's about also, this is really key, deploying our chorus and orchestra, taking them out of the opera house, out of formal performance settings, getting them out into community spaces. And I think that's really important. And they love doing it as well. And that really helps. And then again, focus on the process, not just the culmination moment. And our example of that is our Richmond Hill residency, and I won't go into detail about that because I don't have time, but that's where we started piloting this kind of approach to community engagement, which went down really well. And I'll just read this quote before I finish. What happened was we put together a working group. We approached different services and residents in that area, and we formed a collective that co-devised together how we were going to work in that area, and what we ended up with, based on what people were wanting, was a week-long community festival curated by community. And so this is what happened. Collectively, in this week alone, the company has delivered 12 events over the course of 6 days, with 46 performers from Opera North's Chorus and Orchestra, 105 performers from across the Richmond Hill community in 7 venues to an audience of over 1,000, of which over 150 were active participants in workshops and performances, and 27 members of Opera North staff from all corners of the company volunteered to support events. And this is crucial. Opera North is now well known to the community as a force for good in the area. So it's not just about come and see opera, come and access our work. It's about your association with your local opera company. Can you trust your local opera company? Do you have a relationship with your local opera company? And that's the important thing, the relationships.
Thank you so much, Jo. Thank you. Thank you. So, on my list is next, we have Richard, please.
Hi. I'm Richard Willisey, General Director with Birmingham Opera Company. Tall, white male, dark hair, green T-shirt, he, him. Where to start? I mean, some of the conversation we had with Barbara this morning, really about this hybrid model of what might be paid performers and not paid performers, fulfilling a life for opera in the community, and the community fulfilling a life in opera. Basically the fundamentals of our working model, if there is a model. Although Graham Vick, who was the founder of this company, you always used to say, what's the model? And the answer was, find 2 people who want to do it and give them some money. So, I mean, what is it? I mean, what are the examples of the work? Each year we do between 60 and 90 pop-ups of performances. That might be a singer with a pianist and a director in a shopping centre. It might be Nessun Dorma and IKEA in the bed section. It might be... Well, we can watch that if you want. So let's listen to our participants first.
And yeah, it was just fantastic.
It's really wonderful. I enjoyed it. I have got so many friends.
I loved it, and I think it's magic.
If you turn the sound off and let it catch up with its buffering, and I'll keep talking, we should be fine.
Yeah.
So, we do between 60 and 90 pop-up events. We don't have a marketing department. We don't have separate departments. Each project is constructed from scratch, with the clear intention of trying to find repertoire that resonates with the people that we're trying to reach. We do that by spending most of our time with the people we're trying to reach and include, who are, if you look at things like indices of multiple deprivation, most economically challenged, the low numbers are most economically challenged, the high numbers most affluent. We spend, out of the 10 deciles, we spend most of our time in IMD 1 to 3, in the more economically challenged areas. Out of those engagements, around 40% of our volunteers come from those areas. And although most of our work is delivered free at the point of access, in the last show we did, which was Michael Tippett's New Year in a big top tent with the CBSO, over 50% of the ticket buyers were from IMD 1 to 3. So really, there's been a bit of a mention about class and economics and standing within in communities, and I think we've been concentrating particularly because in inner cities that's really a big issue. Access is down to a lot about where you do the work, how you can access it, how much it costs, who you know. And for our directors, they will always have a direct link with the volunteers. We run basically what will be in a commercial model, a beta testing system. So you involve the communities, you involve the people who you want to include and who want to be included at the earliest possible stage. And the creative teams then work with that knowledge and with those people to make work. So in that sense, it's a co-creation, although it might be around large titles like the Michael Tippett, Stockhausen's Mittwoch Licht with the Helicopter String Quartet. It might be small commissions that we're doing at the moment. We're doing 3 or so a year. the volunteers will get engaged with the composer, and they'll check out whether anyone's interested in the idea, whether really simple stuff about the singing we talked about earlier. Does anybody understand what's being sung? Is anybody excited by it? How can we make it better? How can we change the translation? We do everything in English, or at least in the source language of the audience we're trying to reach. Should we try that again? Yeah. I say we haven't got a marketing department. This was made by we were mentoring an intern who made this.
And yeah, it was fantastic. It's really wonderful. I enjoy it. I have got so many friends.
I loved it, and I think it's magic.
So we teach everything by ear. The volunteers.
The idea to give human experience the status of putting it on as big as it should be, making it as big as you possibly can.
Just for me, thinking of me when I was a little girl, if I was exposed to this, I can't imagine the possibilities and that would have been open to me.
And I really enjoyed my time there. I enjoyed singing with everyone. Everyone was welcoming and kind and friendly. And yeah, I really enjoyed my experience here, and I'll definitely be coming back.
It's just been excellent. It's always a privilege, always. Yeah.
That's what I love about building Opera Company as well, because it's very inclusive, it's very representative of the city that we live in.
We spend a lot of time in New Street Station.
Well, I don't usually go to the opera, to tell you the truth.
So I'd like to call next, please, Francesco. Francesco.
Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me? Okay, my name is Francesco Izzo. I am a white male in my late 50s, mid to late, not quite sure. And my pronouns are he, him. I'm originally from Italy, and against the extraordinarily rich scenario that is emerging here of so many exciting realities here in the UK, I've been asked to talk about my affiliation with and involvement in an organization in Italy, which is the Teatro Regio in Parma. Oh yeah, I have slides. Thank you. Is someone happy to, or should we switch? It's just 4 or 5 slides. It's really easy. So maybe it just makes it faster. My affiliation with the Teatro Regio Parma, about which we heard from a different perspective from our very own Barbara Gentili in her wonderful paper about the Logionistas, among other things. The Teatro Regio in Parma is a so-called teatro di tradizione, a traditional theater in Italy. I won't go into the details of what that means, but in a nutshell, it means that it's not one of the leading organizations such as La Scala or the Teatro dell'Opera in Rome or theaters in Naples, Venice, and so on that have more of an international profile and approach. A teatro di tradizione is, by definition and by mission, steeped in its own community. As such, the Teatro Regio runs a season, an opera season. It runs a concert season and a dance season. It has a fairly rich education program, and actually my involvement with them is primarily as director of their Young Artist Program for young opera singers, the Accademia Verdiana. So if we can just move to the next slide, thank you, and next again. That's just a list that I went through, and if we move to the next one still, through the Young Artists Program at the Teatro Regio, I have the opportunity to interact with two of their flagship initiatives, and these are the Festival Verdi and its twin initiative, Verdi Off. Now, the Festival Verdi, many of you will have guessed, has to do with the Italian opera composer Giuseppe Verdi, as mainstream, as old school, as Eurocentric as it gets. And it is an initiative that originated in the year 2001, so it's fairly recent actually, on the 100th anniversary of Verdi's death. It is a festival that, if we move on to the next slide, kindly, it is a festival that presents opera productions along with concerts and other events. It mostly takes place within the walls of the Teatro Regio, of which we saw a couple of pictures, both in Barbara's presentation early and in my own a couple of minutes ago. By the way, Teatro Regio means Royal Theatre. Speaking of heritage and speaking of exclusivity and privilege, that is a complicated baggage to carry with the theatre in Italy, which is, in case you're wondering, a republic and has been since 1946. The Teatro Regio finally originated as a Teatro Ducale when Parma was part of the Duchy of Parma and Piacenza. Then it became a Teatro Regio after the unification of the Kingdom of Italy in 1861. It has remained a Teatro Regio, and it is the main venue, along with some other purpose-built opera houses from the 19th century in neighboring cities, in particular the town of Busseto and the city of Fidenza. So we're talking about an opera festival that looks at its own community, certainly, although it has international relevance. It attracts an audience consisting of legionistas, but also of elites in all the ways that we've talked about earlier, or that Alexandra Wilson talked about earlier. As a counterpart to this festival, if we kindly move to the next slide, there is an initiative called Verdi Off, and this is curated by my colleague and friend Barbara Minghetti. And it is truly complementary to Festival Verdi in that it is not centered on the Teatro Regio or other opera houses, but it is centered on alternative venues that range from streets and squares, so outdoor spaces in and around Parma, schools, prisons, care homes, hospitals. All of the events that Verdi Off promotes are centered on young artists, and so my role is that of preparing, in part, the artists that then perform in Verdi Off. All of the events are free admission, and the spirit of Verdi Off is really to provide an alternative and to rebalance the message that can emerge from a Festival Verdi in the early 21st century. So trying to deconstruct the narrative that opera is elitist, trying to challenge the notion that to go to the opera you need to belong in a certain social class or in certain racial or ethnic groups and have certain financial means and so on and so forth. This is what we deal with, and I think that what emerges from this panel for me is quite humbling in terms of becoming aware how Italian society in relation to opera is very different than UK society, and maybe we can go back to this theme later on. If we kindly move to the next and final slide, just to point out of that Italy might come across rightly as being a little bit far behind. Festival Verdi reaches this year its 25th edition. Verdi Off has only existed for 10 years, since 2016, so it's still a baby, so to speak, and I hope that also, based on the wonderful inspiration from today's roundtable, that it will continue to grow. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francesco. Thank you. And now we come to our last person who is going to do their introduction. So I'm going to ask Beth to go next.
Sumi, can I be annoying and ask you to click? I've got 4, I'll tell you.
Okay.
That's fine,
It's
yeah,
very
of course.
Thank you. So I'm Beth, I'm a white woman in my 30s, I've got brown, curly hair, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm the director of Engage here at ENO. Engage is our learning participation outreach department. I hold on my shoulders the heavy legacy of Lillian Bayliss to sort of continue that vision, which, as we've heard today, is no small act to follow. The department Engage used to be called Bayliss until 4 years ago, and we renamed it Engage, which felt a very brave decision at the time. I think, as all of you today know, her legacy and her values, once you know that, you understand why you title the department Bayliss. But a lot of our work is around engaging new people with opera, and if you don't know who she is, what does Bayliss mean? So we bring that vision and that legacy with us, but we have changed our name for those of you that might have known our work for longer. I think today many people have spoken to the importance of representation, inclusion and diversity within opera. I just want to start with sort of pulling out the fact that I think this intersectionality is really important, and the many layers that inclusivity occupy, we have to consider all of them, but I do want to specifically focus just around disability within this discussion. I think it's really important that when we look to consider inclusivity, disabled people's experiences and presence is considered and prioritised. When I say this, I mean this on all levels of the industry, be that the portrayal of disabled characters, for example, Rigoletto, of casting of disabled performers, both within the portrayal of disabled and non-disabled roles, but also about broader workforce representation and how organisations are progressing and prioritising this work in a way that isn't focusing on visibility. I think it's important to recognise that ENO also has a way to go when it comes to this, and I'd like to just reference Formidability here, who are delivering some really strong purpose-led work in this space. In conversation I've had with them, they referenced to me how important it is that accessibility and EDI is permeating across all areas of opera: audiences, participants, performers, workforce and leadership. It's not enough for us to only think about the audiences or that side of the work. I think the thinking around it needs to be central within workforce and leadership too. If we don't represent disabled people in these conversations, we miss the opportunity to have lived experience forming part of how this change can happen. It feels really topical in this moment in time with the political situation around disability benefits and looking at trying to get disabled people into work as if they're not already working. I just want to reference Patricia, who is in the audience today from Formidability, who's one of their board members. Joanne, their co-founder, referenced to me the 2024 MU census, which detailed that 88% of musicians who had disclosed their disability have faced discrimination after having outed themselves for their status. I think that if we recognise this as the statistical starting point of what disabled people's experience is within this sector, it really hits home the amount of change and progress that's needed. So, speaking to these above points, I think if we really want to ensure opera does exist for everyone, as per the values of ENO, then I think it's crucial that we also look to consider the potential for opera as a tool for social impact and for change, looking beyond only what productions might offer us the possibility for. So, I'd like to talk to you today about 2 of our programmes on Engage that I think reference our work in this space. That's great. No, stay there, sorry. This is the first one, which is ENO Breathe. This is our breathing retraining programme for people with long COVID currently, but we're just piloting for asthma and COPD patients too. This programme has been scientifically assessed to prove its efficacy, horrible word, in supporting people to improve their breathlessness and associated anxiety post-COVID infection. This slide details a little bit, the same one, details a bit about our current reach and impact that I'll just let you read through. and I'll give you a bit of the narrative around it. So as the pandemic halted our usual programming at ENO, we were looking at how best to be useful. It's through this and being putting in touch with Dr. Sarah Elkin, one of the respiratory consultants for Imperial College NHS Trust, that we recognised the part that singing techniques might be able to play in supporting people through their COVID journey. It wasn't a question of how can people benefit from opera or who might want to partake or access this programme, but how might opera be useful. I think this is the inverse of what traditional engagement programmes quite often look like. It's not about who doesn't come or what barriers might prevent them from coming, how can we do something about this? It's about actually posing the question, how might opera matter to people in this moment? By breaking down the art form into much smaller component parts, we were able to find this really specific niche that genuinely helps people by working alongside our clinical partners to hone and refine the exercises that we deliver. The thing that I think is also really unique about this more healthcare space is that we were able to bring up with us the supportive, empathetic and nurturing space that exists within arts programmes. This was and remains to be so important for people with long COVID who have all been through something disabling, which means that they are disabled or cut off from the way our society functions. Especially as people move on from the pandemic, they have and will continue to be left behind if programmes like ENO Breathe aren't there. With all of our work, projects are co-created and for communities or the people that we ensure that the usual barriers that might be obstacles for them can be adapted or removed and that they can access our work, our building and our projects easily. I believe that if the pandemic hadn't stopped our business as usual, we probably wouldn't have been able to make ENO Breathe the programme that is today. If we go to the next slide, this is just a picture, a nice quote. The second programme that I'd like to cover are our relaxed performances. Tumi, do you mind to go to the next slide? Thank you. We've only been running these here since 2019, but in that time we've learnt loads and our audiences have grown significantly. We saw 400 people attend our first one in 2019, and now regularly we see between 1,500 and 2,000 people come. This is testament to the potential audience that we can see if we simply ensure that there is programming which is appropriate for people. What began as an audience-facing programme has grown into so much more, an embedded, reflective and influential programme for us as a company. I'd firstly like to mention also how much people across the company enjoy them, from our costume staff running our sensory stations to performers being able to feel a much more responsive audience and also see them as the lights in the auditorium are up. They've really become a highlight for so many in our season. We work with people with lived experience of various disabilities to create tailored resources for each of our shows. From visual guides to widget timetables and sensory guidance, we try to ensure audiences are well equipped for their experiences. And we're on a real learning journey with this, collaborating with disabled-led theatre company Tourette Zero to adapt their sonic stories, which is what you see on the right-hand side here, which were originally conceived for theatre for performances of opera. Through our work with them on these, this relationship has also progressed into that of a critical friend and advocate, supporting ENO not only to reflect on the resources that we make from a more finalised production, but also to challenge us to think beyond this into what an appropriate representation is and should look like on stage, how to consider adaptations and adjustments from the get-go rather than as an after effect. I'm confident that through our relaxed performances, we're also starting to make an impact around about who gets to make, perform and watch opera. I think we're in a really timely moment that we have a chance to shape what opera is, I think, controversially maybe, but it can be whatever we want it to be, and through programmes that reconsider what the form opera takes is, it allows us to make change much quicker, ensuring that art form can be as inclusive and as valuable to as many people as possible.
Okay, thank you, Beth. Well, there's been quite a lot that's been shared with you, and there are some questions that we have thought about that we'd like to put to the round table. And the first question I wanted to ask, and probably towards the end there'll be a sort of roundup of some of the strands that you've heard, but where opera takes place and why does this matter? And when you take opera outside of the opera house, how can this change who experiences it? So kind of follow-up is, what could the relationship to the opera house be? So that's a question to the round table. Who would like to go?
Can I start? Is that okay?
You can start, Beth.
So ENO Breathe, which obviously you've just heard me talk about, the intention for that programme was never really to get people into the opera house. It was, as I said, to try and make something that was helpful. But as a real, again, a beautiful side story, we've developed 4,000 people who've been through the programme that are also become massive fans or advocates for E&O as a company, but also for opera. So they learn lullabies on the programme. Some are from operas, but not all of them. But we have, from demand from the people that have been through the programme, now started a regular weekly programme called Our Twilights for people that have completed it that can continue to drop in. And that then wasn't enough. So we had a big demand from participants to be like, we want to come together, we want to actually meet each other, and we want to make our own work. So from that, we created a creative programme for those participants. They wrote 3 of their own lullabies, which we now learn on the programme. And they came together here at the Coliseum between December and May, 2 years ago, and performed as a curtain raiser that piece. And these groups of people that they see the Coliseum in our videos, but they'd never been here before, most of them, had this beautiful affinity, connection, value. It made all of us cry, themselves included, all of us. And I thought that was really interesting because it wasn't our intention, but it still grows that connection. You don't have to be here to have it.
But there's an idea of breadcrumbing, so you actually sort of bring people to the Opera House. What are the other responses to that question? Michael, then Francesco.
Yeah, with us, the piece that Toomey created, originally as the digital piece you saw, we then commissioned a 15-minute live performance version of it. And it's based around food, so we also created the opportunity to share food at the end of the performance. So the jollof rice that he triumphantly produces at the end is then shared with the audience. And that was an extraordinary communal feeling. You know, there's nothing better than food together to create a community and to open a conversation. And the joy of that was we were playing in community centres around Wales where opera was certainly not a part of what they would normally do. And it completely shifted people's attitudes and opinions in the same way that you're talking. Because of the human contact, it suddenly became real and accessible and enjoyable, and real for them in a way that they could relate to. So the relatability is such an important part of it.
Indeed.
I think, Toomey, you felt as a performer that connection.
Absolutely, the representation in the audience was there, and like the conversations that happened stemmed from the performances were quite unique in the sense that avid opera goers who saw opera 20 times a year were like, I've never seen anything like this.
Yes, so giving new experiences, unique experiences, and really giving added enrichment after performances is kind of key. Francesco. And then Joe.
No, just going back to the whole question of Verdi off that we have in Parma, I think that the question of place has enormous relevance in terms of making us think about what opera is, but beyond what we think, it really has relevance in terms of what opera is. In an old school context where going to the opera means attending a full-scale staged performance of a duration of 3+ hours. Typically, an event that happens outside of the walls of a purpose-built opera house is or often is something very, very, very different. Meaning it can be a concert, it can be a reinterpretation and actualization of a classic. The focus seems to be often, but not all the time, really, is the voice. And it seems to me that having witnessed a number of these outreach events in the context of Verdi Off, really what is striking from the point of view of those who are somewhat used to going to the opera and those who aren't at all is the peculiar, technical, audible aspects of a classically trained singing voice. Other than that, really, the sky is the limit, or maybe the ceiling is the limit if you're then back in the opera house.
Thank you, Joe.
I think there's a lot around how safe spaces feel for people, and I think for a lot of people the opera house perhaps isn't a safe space. I think there's certainly a place and to experience opera in an opera house, massive stage, loads of seats is an amazing experience, but it's one version of an experience. But I think for a lot of people, walking into an opera, people wouldn't do it if they've never been before. That is a huge barrier. But also, even if you have, I'm speaking from the Leeds Grand Theatre, it's a really inaccessible space. You can't even take a buggy in there. There's no buggy parking. You go straight in. There's no foyer. You're hit with a massive grand staircase. It's an intimidating space. When you go in, even me, somebody that's culturally engaged and grew up with opera, I don't like the feeling sometimes of, oh, I'm not allowed to even move in my seat because someone might tut at me, or I'm not allowed to eat my crisps, which you would in the cinema, but maybe in opera, that's frowned upon. You don't want to hear a rustling crisp packet. It can feel like a space where you have to behave in a particular way, and there's a right way to behave and a wrong way to behave. And I think as soon as you take opera out of that environment, it can really change how people are able to engage with it and how safe people feel in the presence of it.
That's really interesting. So I have another question. So I think we've talked about sort of opening up opera and, sort of there's something here about giving it space to breathe and giving it space to breathe in other spaces and non-site specific spaces, and the way you're going to communities and rather than communities coming, rather than expecting communities to come to you. But going back to the presentation we had earlier, what's the long-term responsibility of publicly funded opera companies to our communities? Can we articulate some thoughts on that? Alison.
I've always felt that it's our duty to reflect the communities we serve. So if you're in London, you look at the diversity of London, say a company like ENO, what are the stories that are on the stage? Who are the people that are on the stage? Do they reflect the community? If I'm in, I don't know, Dorset or something, maybe I'm not going to be quite as bothered about being diverse. But in London and when we go to other places, you have to reflect. And I think that the important thing is, again, the spaces that you use, not just expecting people to come to you, going into different areas. I always say, when I'm in America, I'm always talking about Birmingham Opera, because to me that's like the holy grail of engagement in terms of community. It is. It just is. It's just fabulous. And I think it makes people feel included. It's like, we go to them in any space. We create life in the community, and I think it's just so important.
The life in the community. So, does anyone disagree with that on the round table in terms of, that there is a responsibility for publicly funded opera companies to be working in specific ways and reflecting the diversity of communities, but also in terms of globally, in a global majority world? Michael.
I'd like to go a bit further. I'm Michael. He's Richard.
Yeah, that's Michael.
I'd like to go a little bit further,
yes.
Which is to talk about the role that opera, as a part of all the performing arts, all of the arts, has a responsibility for the well-being of society, actually. Mm-hmm. I think it's not just about the health of opera. Mm-hmm. I think it's, and Breathe is a really interesting example of health that can be impacted by operatic kind of form and work. But I think we have a much bigger role to play. So if we're not addressing diversity, if we're not addressing the stories of the people who we are now, if we're not engaging in the widest possible way around society, then we're not playing a full and healthy role in the welfare of society, the way that we look and talk to each other, the way that we communicate, the way that we share the lives that we have to share because we're all in the same place, the way that we actually have an impact, I think potentially an economic impact on people's well-being, which is that there's with Breathe you might be able to get people even back into work. And that's economic. Yes. And I think all of these things are part of what we need to think about as the responsibility as performing arts organisations.
Taking the health of society, I wondered what the Roundtable's take is on the idea of having insiders and outsiders in the opera industry, and how might this shape your practice, and how can we use this in thinking, how to better work together. I might ask you, Alison, to respond to that first.
Insiders and outsiders meaning?
In the opera industry, what does that mean to you?
Gosh, I don't know. So insiders, I guess that's us, and outsiders are the people that come, maybe. That's how we see it. And I think that we need to not think of it as, because to me that seems like them and us a little bit. Outsiders and insiders, the co-creation, everyone is an insider. Everyone is welcome. I think, to me, that I speak to that.
I'm going to pick up something that Patricia mentioned early on, that there's a glass box at the top and there's actually glass ceilings for people in the opera industry. What does the Roundtable feel about that? How do we get more representative in terms of the making, the creation, and in terms of the workforce as well as audiences, in terms of going forward, given demographics of audiences and how one doesn't want to contemplate a trophying in any way and becoming a museum form. So how do we address that?
Can I make a personal statement on that front? So when I was looking at the future of Music Theatre Wales during COVID, thinking about the role and thinking about how we could change the creation, the creative process and the engagement and the relevance of opera. I also had to, of course, look at myself and think, is this about personal legacy? And what I realised was that here I am in Cardiff, running a company funded by the Arts Council of Wales, that if I threw the towel in, that there was no way the Arts Council of Wales was going to say, let's look for a new opera company to fund again. That just would not happen. So I felt actually I had a responsibility, which is the word I've just used before, to make sure that there was a future opportunity for future opera makers to take it in the own way they wanted to. So that had to change. And the way to change that was to start changing the top of the company. So I now have an artistic associate appointed in 2020 who is Somali heritage, who's British, and who is creating new opera and who is supporting the development of the company very powerfully. And I think that is the only way to change it.
So, did you want to make another comment, Alison?
So I remember we did a production with the Limbury Theatre and Kate Wyatt. And when we were talking, I said, opera's run by white people, posh white people, went to private school, it's a certain demographic. And she gave me such a look. And I thought, oh, God. And as we got to know each other, she totally was not the demographic that I think are the people that go to opera. I went to a private girls' school, and it's those girls and their parents that go to the opera in my mind. She was just regular council estate, or not council estate, but you know what I mean, local comprehensive, and she was a different person running an opera company. And I thought, wow, that is a change. Because things start from the top down. You can't have the same people who are saying the narrative and then talking about diversity, but it's the same people that you see and all these things. You need to have from the top a different board, the people who run the administration. And I noticed that the staff are not the people that I think. And so therefore within that staff, and she said, because of the staff who they are driving change at the Royal Opera House and have expectations of more inclusion. And I think that's really important.
Yes. Well, I think at this point it might be good to just draw a few things, and then we'll go to the audience. So we're looking at tools of change, and we're looking at how discrimination and barriers can be dismantled, whether that's sex, gender, race, disability, LGBTQ, that is centralised in terms of the policies and the practices, which requires new thinking and new strategies for new co-creation and collaboration. But also it needs new work, and it needs contemporary work. And one of the things that has come out very strongly is music opera music as a great connector. And that's something that I'm very much going to be taking away. But we need to look at ourselves in Britain, but we also need to look at us in terms of a global context and to be able to reflect meaningfully the diversity of 21st century Britain. We need to counter toxic narratives, which has also been brought up. We need to emphasize the creative health. We need to look at communities as asset plus and not a deficit model, and ask ourselves, how can opera be useful to communities to embed EDI, diversity and inclusion as well, and also to be thinking about audiences and changing our audiences and looking at the demographics of our audiences and thinking very creatively about those sorts of things, and looking at reinterpretation and looking at the canon, but at the same time very much investing. And on that final point, I will just mention on the investing, we're talking about massive amount of resources in terms of the context of the opera industry and how we need to be thinking about how that is reinvested. So at this point, I'm going to draw that to a close and to ask the audience if they have some questions, but also to thank our roundtable. Would you give them a round of applause? Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you so much to the panel. You have a question?
Thank you so much. My name is Helen Eppiger, also known as the Venus Bushfires. I am the writer, composer, librettist of the world's first pidgin English opera. So I do have to plug my show because it's self-funded. So we've got a run at Wilton's on the 24th to 26th of April. And really, it's our 10th year anniversary. And I'm self-taught. I'm a synesthete. I don't read or write music. Yet this has happened. So for me, this is a moment of possibility, as well as it is scary putting on your own show on a big stage. But there are so many opportunities at the moment, especially when you don't know what you're not supposed to do and what you can't do. So I think also I'd like to ask the panel, as well as whoever wants to put a hand up, do you think that now is the time to strategize, but also now is the time to possibly be extremely delusional?
Why, yes, of course. It's the arts. Why not? If that brings about big change, because today is a moment, I would say, of inauguration to begin a process of change in the opera industry, which is most timely and most needed. Round table, responses? Can we be delusional?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'd say that. I think I was when I was writing this, because I was writing for an opera singer who I didn't know how many words to put in 4 bars. You know, 1 word, and she'll hold a note for 4 bars, whereas I'll put 800 words in 4 bars. So yeah, I was just going, I've got to put 1 word in there. This is not the way I write music. And I felt I was losing my mind because I just could not just put 1 word down. But yeah, I think
learn new things.
Yes, absolutely.
I think if we're not delusional, then that's so many barriers. Because, you know, even I always say I have to be delusional as a soprano to get up in front of thousands of people or whatever number of people and think they actually want to hear me singing. So I have that delusion which takes away the barriers and allows me to do the thing. And then how we grow and because we create and we just go, okay, let's try this. And we get it wrong sometimes we don't. But I think that delusion helps. Right.
I didn't believe that it was possible to create anything useful or interesting or meaningful in a digital format, coming from a live performance opera world. And then I had the opportunity from a producing theatre who phoned us up and said, we're doing an online thing, would you as an opera company like to make something? So I put a composer and a director together who had never met, never heard of each other. They never met. And they created a piece of work that was 5 minutes long, that was really meaningful to them as creative artists, that spoke a very simple and beautiful and profound message. And that opened up the possibilities. You know, I had to defeat my own prejudice to be able to think that that was possible. Yeah, we've got to be deluded.
Here.
I'm so impressed with the things that are coming out. I'm Patricia St. Hilaire. From Formability. Say it? Formidability. It's one of my things. Anyway, I'm so excited to be here to represent them because as a black woman, as a black artist in her mid-60s, some might call it late, I'm sticking to mid, I am really, really, really pleased because in the 80s, I worked for the Lillian Baylis programme, writing and directing opera in a school in Tottenham. And it was working with 7-year-olds, bringing them in. So when you talk about being delusional, I don't want to think of it as being delusional. I want to think of it as dreaming. If you can dare to dream of how you want to see the world change and how you want to be represented in it, go girl, go and do it. And that's what I did back in the 80s with young black children in a school in Tottenham who really didn't know anything about opera, and they rapped. I didn't know anything about rapping, that wasn't my thing, but that was their thing, and they told their stories. And they came here in the 80s, and they were disruptive, and they enjoyed it. They were disruptive because they enjoyed it in a way that you don't behave here. But what they did and what they were is that they enjoyed it. And I'm really hoping that those seeds that were planted back in the 80s have gone on to become you and you.
Yes.
So yes, it's absolutely be magical and be daring to dream because it's possible.
I think I'm going to take that as an inspiration for my sort of final remarks, really, for what has been an extraordinary afternoon and sharing and a conversation that has been quite generous. Dare to Dream. My company is called Dare to Diva, which is about bringing people into the spotlight. And I think, yes, delusional is a word, but I would probably say visionary and use the word you have used. That I think we can dream and we can vision opera and the opera industry as it is now in a very different and reconfigured way, which I think is absolutely timely at this moment. You know, when we were hearing about Benjamin Britten, I think history, knowing where you are at any given point in history to make a change, to make an impact, now is the time we can have, I believe, a renaissance of opera and for it to be configured and more accessible and madly exciting than it ever has been. Thank you all so much. I hope you continue these conversations. We're going to have drinks. Please don't go. We would like to meet and talk with people. But I firstly want to thank the E&O and the University of Surrey and to thank my colleagues here on the round table. Please give them a warm round of applause.
We'd like to thank you, Carol, for being a wonderful host.
Yes, thank you so much,
Thank you so
Carol.
much.
It's been my great pleasure.
Yeah.
And as I said, I hope to see you again. I hope this is a process that continues.
And thank you, the audience, for coming here today and being part of this conversation. As Carol says, we're now going to have drinks. We hope you can join us to continue. It feels like we could have had this 3 hours on this. It's just scratching the surface.
As we say in Jamaica, more time, which
More
means
time.
this is not an end.
So, Barbara would like you to respond to this question on the screen before we go downstairs to have a drink. Could you please just jot a few notes on the post-it note underneath your chair?
Leave it on your chair.
In response to the question, and you can leave your post-it note once you've written down your response. Just leave it on your chair. But we would love to collect your thoughts and responses and reflections on this question. In which way has today's event changed your opinion about the ways in which opera has engaged and does engage with its communities? As you're all writing, I did just want to say one more thing, which is that, yes, we hope that this conversation is the first of many, and we will keep you posted about future developments in this space. So thank you very much again before you all disperse to the panel, to Carol and to the University of Surrey and Barbara Gentili. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.